My ruthless billionaire ex-husband collapsed at his New Year gala, and the doctor who rushed in was our son he abandoned. The moment Vance Blackwood hit the marble floor, champagne shattering across Italian tiles, the entire ballroom froze. His young wife's scream cut through Auld Lang Syne like a siren. I stood motionless in my rented dress, 15 feet from the man who'd walked out on our 3-year-old son without a backward glance. The man whose child support came with a note saying he wasn't suited for fatherhood. Clear the way. Please, I'm a doctor. That voice. I knew that voice. The crowd parted as a tall figure in a tuxedo rushed forward, medical bag in hand. My heart stopped as he knelt beside the fallen billionaire. Marcus. My son. Our son. The boy I'd raised alone through medical school, working double shifts and reading textbooks during his soccer practices. No pulse. He called out, beginning chest compressions. Someone call an ambulance. I watched my son's steady hands working to save the father who hadn't sent so much as a birthday card in 15 years. Neither of them knew. How could they? Marcus had never seen his father's face except in old photographs and financial magazines. Security began herding guests toward the exits, but I couldn't move, transfixed by this cosmic collision of past and present. Across the room, Marcus glanced up, saw me standing there, and for a split second, confusion flickered across his features. Mom. What are you doing here? How do you tell your son that he's currently trying to restart the heart of the father who abandoned him? Thank you for helping Mr. Arden's Heart Stories pass 500 subscribers. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or just discovered our channel, your support means everything. Please share this video right now with anyone who's ever wondered if fate has a sense of humor, or if the universe eventually balances its accounts. Have you ever stood at the intersection of your past and present, watching worlds collide that were never meant to meet? By the end of this story, you'll see how 15 years of careful separation can crumble in 15 seconds, and how the children we raise return to us in ways we never imagined. I should have known better than to accept the invitation to Blackwood Tower's annual gala. But curiosity is a powerful force, almost as powerful as the need to prove to yourself that old wounds have finally scarred over. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, cream-colored cardstock embossed with the Blackwood Properties logo and addressed to Dr. Olivia Chen, Director, Eastside Community Health Initiative. Not to Vance's ex-wife. Not to the woman he'd left with a 3-year-old son and unfinished medical school dreams. Just a professional courtesy extended to the director of a clinic his corporation was considering for philanthropic partnership. I nearly threw it away. My fingers actually hovered over the trash can, the invitation dangling between them. Then practicality overrode emotion. My clinic needed funding. The patients we served, mostly low-income families in neighborhoods Blackwood Properties was circling for development, needed an advocate inside that glittering tower. If swallowing my pride for one evening could secure resources for hundreds of vulnerable families, wasn't that worth the discomfort? So I said yes, purchased a simple black dress from a consignment shop, and told myself I was attending as Dr. Chen, not as the woman Vance Blackwood had once promised to love until death parted them. I never imagined death would nearly come for him with me as a witness. Or that our son would be the one standing between Vance and whatever awaited him beyond this life. As paramedics arrived and wheeled Vance toward the service elevator, Marcus shot me one last confused glance before following the stretcher, still calling out vital signs and medical orders. The doors closed, and just like that, 15 years of carefully maintained separation collapsed. How had we come to this moment? How had the universe orchestrated this impossible collision? The answer begins, as these stories often do, with a chance meeting between two people who should never have crossed paths. 15 years earlier, I had been Olivia Chen, second-year medical student, working nights at an upscale Manhattan bar to pay for textbooks and rent. He had been Vance Blackwood, 32, and already making waves in commercial real estate development. The night we met, I was exhausted. 12 hours of classes and lab work followed by an 8-hour shift mixing cocktails for people whose evening drink budgets exceeded my weekly food allowance. My feet ached, my brain felt like cotton, and all I wanted was to finish my shift, review my immunology notes, and collapse into bed. 10 minutes to closing, the door swung open, admitting a group of men in expensive suits, laughing and loosening ties as they entered. I bit back a groan. Late arrivals meant a delayed escape. "Take care of them, Liv," my manager whispered. "That's Vance Blackwood with the Kingston investors. The deal they're celebrating will put their kids through college and their grandkids through med school." The men settled at the bar, ordering single malts and congratulating each other on whatever financial conquest they'd achieved. All except one. He sat slightly apart, his attention on the restaurant's architectural details rather than his celebrating colleagues. "What can I get you?" I asked, approaching him last. "Water, please." Still, not sparkling. I raised an eyebrow. "That's it? We have a 25-year Macallan your friends seem to be enjoying." He smiled then, and something shifted in the air between us. A genuine smile that transformed his serious features and reached his eyes. Not a practiced business expression, but something more spontaneous. "I've found clearer thinking leads to better decisions, especially after closing major deals," he said. His gaze dropped to the immunology textbook I'd tucked beneath the bar. "What are you studying?" I hesitated, unused to patrons showing interest in anything beyond their drinks. "Immunology. I'm in my second year of medical school." Instead of the standard nod and subject change I'd come to expect, he leaned forward slightly. "My mother was an immunologist. Brilliant woman. Died of lupus when I was 12, which seems particularly unfair for someone who dedicated her life to understanding autoimmune disease." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. This man, with his bespoke suit and commanding presence, had briefly allowed his polished facade to slip, revealing something real beneath. "I'm sorry about your mother," I said, meaning it. That's the tragic irony of medicine sometimes. We're drawn to heal what's wounded us, but knowledge doesn't guarantee protection. He studied me with newfound interest. "That's remarkably insightful. Most people just say, 'Sorry for your loss,' and change the subject. Most people are uncomfortable with grief. I've found it's better to acknowledge it directly." "Are you always this forthright with customers?" "Only the ones who order water in a whiskey bar." He laughed then, a rich sound that turned heads at the other end of the bar. "I'm Vance, by the way." "Olivia. What branch of medicine are you pursuing, Olivia?" "I'm leaning toward pediatrics," I answered. "Though it changes monthly, depending on which rotation fascinates me most." The conversation continued as I served his companions and began closing procedures. Unlike the typical wealthy patron who viewed service workers as furniture, Vance asked questions and actually listened to the answers. About my studies. My family parents who'd emigrated from Taiwan before I was born, their sacrifice to provide opportunities they'd never had. My ambitions beyond medical school. By the time his group prepared to leave, I'd shared more with this stranger than with people I'd known for months. There was something about him, a focused attention that made you feel like the most important person in his world, if only for that moment. As they stood to leave, Vance lingered, writing something on a business card. "I've enjoyed our conversation, Olivia. If you'd ever like to continue it over dinner, call this number. It's my private line, not my office." I should have said no. Should have recognized that we occupied different worlds that could only collide, not merge. Should have seen that a man who could afford to build skyscrapers might eventually view a struggling medical student as another acquisition, not a partner. But his eyes held something I rarely saw in the ambitious men who frequented the bar. Genuine interest beyond the superficial, a hint of loneliness beneath the success. 3 days later, I called. 1 week later, we had dinner at a restaurant so exclusive it had no sign on the door. 2 months later, I was spending weekends at his Hamptons house, discussing medical ethics over breakfast and watching the sunset from his private beach. Vance Blackwood was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Brilliant, driven, with an almost photographic memory for details. He could discuss urban development philosophy one minute and quote poetry the next. His wealth had purchased comfort but not contentment, and he seemed genuinely fascinated by my comparatively simple life. "Look at this building," he once said, pointing to a sleek tower as we walked through Midtown. "Most people see glass and steel. I see potential energy. The possibility of human connection. Hundreds of lives intersecting in ways they never would have without this structure existing." "You're a romantic about real estate," I teased. He shook his head. "I'm a realist about human potential. Buildings are just vessels for possibility." That was the Vance I fell in love with. Not the real estate magnate featured in business magazines, but the man who saw possibility everywhere and spoke of his developments as communities rather than properties. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. I lived in a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, studied until my eyes burned, and calculated whether I could afford both laundry and coffee in the same week. He lived in a penthouse with panoramic views, had staff who anticipated his needs before he expressed them, and made decisions daily that involved millions of dollars. Yet when we were together, those differences seemed to fade. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. His childhood as the son of a brilliant scientist mother and distant, demanding father. My struggles as a first-generation American, caught between cultures. Our shared love of classical music and spicy food. Our mutual dislike of pretension despite his wealth. 6 months into our relationship, Vance took me to Paris for a weekend. Just a weekend, as if crossing the Atlantic for 48 hours was a normal occurrence. We had dinner in the Eiffel Tower, walked along the Seine at midnight, and made love in a hotel suite larger than my entire apartment. "This could be our life, Olivia," he said as we watched dawn break over the city. "You and me, building something extraordinary together." "I think medical students and real estate developers have different definitions of building," I laughed. He kissed me then, tender and intense. "I'm serious. I've never met anyone like you. Someone who sees me, not my bank account or my business potential. Someone who challenges me to be better." I was 25, in love, and presented with a vision of life so far beyond my modest expectations that it seemed like a dream. Of course I believed him. Of course I thought his wealth wouldn't change us. Of course I imagined we could merge our worlds without either of us losing our essential selves. 1 year into our relationship, I missed a period. Then another. The home pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines almost immediately. I sat on the edge of my bathtub, staring at the plastic stick with a mixture of terror and wonder. A baby. Vance's baby. Our baby. A tiny life taking shape inside me while I was still shaping my own life, still years from completing my medical training. We'd been careful. But apparently not careful enough. I called Vance from the bathroom, my voice shaking, that I need to see you tonight. It's important. What's wrong? Are you okay? I'm pregnant. Silence stretched between us, long enough for my heart to drop into my stomach. I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, 18 minutes later, my apartment buzzer sounded. Vance stood in the hallway, slightly breathless, as if he'd run part of the way. Are you sure? He asked, stepping inside. I nodded, showing him the test. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my shock, he smiled. A real smile that transformed his face. That's amazing, Liv. You're not upset. Why would I be upset? He took my hands in his. This is unexpected, certainly. But not unwelcome. Vance, I'm still in medical school. I have at least 5 more years of training ahead. This isn't exactly ideal timing. His expression grew serious. What do you want to do? I paused, surprised by the certainty I suddenly felt. I want this baby. But I also want my career. I don't want to choose. Then don't, he said simply. We'll make it work. Together. 1 week later, he proposed. Not with a grand gesture in a public place, but quietly, in my apartment, after we'd spent the evening discussing how a baby would change our lives. "I know this might seem like I'm proposing because of the pregnancy," he said, kneeling before me with a ring box in hand. "I'm not. I'm proposing because I love you, and because I want to build a life with you. A real life, not just glass and steel, but something with a foundation that will last generations." The ring inside the box was stunning but not ostentatious, a vintage emerald-cut diamond in a platinum setting that somehow perfectly balanced elegance and understatement. "My mother's ring," he explained. "The only thing of hers my father didn't sell after she died. I've been keeping it for the right person. That's you, Olivia." Tears blurred my vision as he slipped it onto my finger. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes to all of it." We were married 2 months later in a small ceremony at his Hamptons house. Just close friends and my parents, who regarded Vance with a mixture of cautious approval and bewilderment. Their daughter, marrying one of the wealthiest men in Manhattan. Their future grandchild, who would never know the financial struggles they had endured. The first years were intoxicating. We moved into a stunning apartment overlooking Central Park, with enough rooms that I could have a dedicated study for my medical books. Vance hired household staff who made my life almost embarrassingly comfortable, preparing meals, keeping the apartment immaculate, running errands that would have eaten into my study time. When Marcus was born healthy, red-faced, and vocal from his first breath, Vance seemed genuinely transformed. He hired a night nurse so I could sleep between feedings, but insisted on being present for morning cuddles and evening baths. He read business journals aloud to our infant son, claiming that early exposure to complex vocabulary was beneficial for neural development. I took a leave of absence from medical school, planning to return when Marcus turned 1. Vance supported this decision without hesitation. "Your career matters as much as mine," he insisted. "We'll make it work. Whatever childcare arrangements you need, whatever support systems will help you succeed, they're yours." I believed him. Not just because I wanted to, but because he seemed sincere. In those early days, watching him cradle our son with genuine wonder, I thought I'd found the perfect partner, someone who valued my ambitions as much as his own. The first hairline fracture in our foundation appeared when Marcus was 7 months old. Blackwood Properties had been expanding steadily, but now Vance had his sights on international markets. Late nights at the office became the norm. Weekend trips to potential development sites meant days without seeing his son. When home, he was physically present but mentally elsewhere, constantly checking his phone, slipping away to take calls, disappearing into his home office for hours. "It's temporary," he'd assure me when I expressed concern. "Just until we secure the Tokyo development. Things will calm down after that." They never calmed down. Each success bred hunger for the next. Each acquisition required 3 more to maintain momentum. Each milestone in our son's life, first words, first steps, first recognizable drawing, was acknowledged with distracted pride, Vance's attention inevitably drawn back to whatever deal was currently consuming him. By the time Marcus turned 2, our lives had developed a pattern. Vance traveled extensively, returning with elaborate gifts for our son and promises of future family time that rarely materialized. I had returned to medical school, juggling classes and clinical rotations with motherhood, increasingly feeling like a single parent despite my husband's financial support. The day our marriage ended began like any other. Marcus, 3 and precocious, building impossibly complex structures with his blocks. Me, reviewing notes for an upcoming exam. Vance, home between trips to Singapore and Dubai. "I need to discuss something," he said, joining me in the living room. His voice carried the same tone he used for business calls. Measured. Controlled. "I've been offered an opportunity that could double our market position overnight." "That's wonderful," I said automatically, having learned the expected responses. "It will require significant travel for the next year. Possibly longer." He hesitated, eyes fixed on a point beyond my shoulder. "I'll need to relocate to Hong Kong temporarily." "For how long?" 18 months. Maybe 2 years. And we'll join you there. I already knew the answer from his expression. That's not practical, he replied, his tone gentle but firm. Your studies are here. Marcus has his routine, his preschool. The international schools have waiting lists years long. It makes more sense for me to commute back when I can. So you're choosing Blackwood Properties over your family. He flinched the only time I'd seen my words physically impact him. I'm not choosing anything over anything. I'm building our future. You're building your future, I corrected. And designing it without spaces for us. The argument escalated, releasing years of accumulated frustration. My sacrificed time with Marcus to accommodate Vance's schedule. His missed milestones in our son's life. The growing distance between us that no luxury apartment or exotic vacation could bridge. Maybe we should take a break, he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. Give each other space to evaluate what we want. I knew then it was over. Not because he suggested separation, but because of the relief that flashed across his face when the words left his mouth. Vance moved into a hotel that weekend. Within a month, divorce papers arrived, offering generous financial terms in exchange for a quick, quiet dissolution. No messy custody battles. No public drama that might affect stock prices or investor confidence. I took the settlement. Not for myself, but for Marcus. For the security it would provide, the education it would fund, the opportunities it would create. Vance promised to remain involved in his son's life despite the distance. The Hong Kong opportunity will take most of my attention for the next year, he acknowledged during our final conversation. But I'll call Marcus regularly. Visit when I'm in town. We'll make it work. I wanted to believe him. For Marcus's sake, I needed to believe him. 3 months later, a certified letter arrived containing a cashier's check and a brief note on Blackwood Properties letterhead. I've realized I'm not suited for fatherhood. Marcus deserves better than halfway parenting. The enclosed trust will provide for his needs through adulthood. I've asked my lawyers not to contact you further. Just like that, Vance Blackwood excised himself from our lives. No explanation to his 3-year-old son about why Daddy stopped calling. No response to the tearful voicemails I left, pleading for him to reconsider, not for my sake but for Marcus's. When I finally reached his assistant, her response was polished, practiced, and utterly devoid of humanity. Mr. Blackwood is unavailable indefinitely on personal matters. His attorneys will handle any necessary communications regarding the trust. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that his father has decided parenting is inconvenient? That love can be replaced with a trust fund? That the man who once read him bedtime stories now considers him a closed chapter in his life? The day the letter arrived, I sat on my bathroom floor and sobbed until I had nothing left. Not for the marriage that had been dying for months before the official end. Not even for myself. I cried for Marcus, who would grow up without the father he adored. For the questions I couldn't answer. For the rejection he was too young to understand but would eventually have to process. When the tears finally stopped, I looked at myself in the mirror and made a promise. I would not allow Vance's absence to define our lives. I would become both parents to my son. I would fill the void with enough love and stability that Marcus would know, beyond any doubt, that he was wanted, cherished, and enough. If you've ever had to piece together a broken heart, yours or your child's, while the world kept demanding your presence, hit that like button right now. Comment both mother and father if you understand what it means to be everything to someone who's lost half their foundation. And subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories if you believe that what breaks us can ultimately remake us stronger. The first year alone was the hardest. Balancing medical school with single parenthood. Explaining to a toddler that his father wasn't coming home. Watching Marcus wait by the window on his 4th birthday, certain that his dad would remember, would show up with the remote control helicopter they'd seen in a store window months earlier. He didn't. Instead, an impersonal card arrived, signed by Vance's assistant. Is Daddy mad at me? Marcus asked that night, his small face solemn in the glow of his birthday candles. The question shattered something inside me. No, baby. Never. Your daddy loves you very much. He's just very busy with his work. Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. Not the kind meant to deceive, but the kind meant to protect. The truth that his father had chosen a different life, one that didn't include being a parent, was too cruel for a 4-year-old to bear. I promised myself then that I would never lie to Marcus again about his father's absence. But I would frame the truth in ways that protected his self-worth. The failure was Vance's, not Marcus's. Some people aren't equipped for parenthood. His father's departure reflected no shortcoming in my precious son. We developed routines, weekend pancake breakfasts, bedtime stories no matter how exhausted I was, detailed explanations of medical concepts when he asked questions about my studies. I sold the oversized apartment Vance had purchased, unable to bear the emptiness of all that space, and bought a smaller place near the hospital where I would eventually complete my residency. The trust fund Vance had established remained untouched, my own private rebellion. We lived on my student loans and part-time work as a research assistant, not luxuriously but comfortably enough. I wanted Marcus to understand that we didn't need his father's money to be happy, even if that money rightfully belonged to him for his future. Why do people get sick? 5-year-old Marcus asked one evening as I studied pathology at the kitchen table. Sometimes invaders get into our bodies' germs, too small to see, I explained, setting aside my books. Our bodies are like castles with guards who fight off these invaders. But sometimes the guards don't recognize the enemy, or there are too many invaders to fight. I want to be a bodyguard when I grow up, he declared solemnly. A doctor, you mean? He nodded, eyes serious. Like you, Mom. So I can help people's bodyguards fight better. That's the night I realized that despite everything we'd lost, Marcus and I were building something precious together. Not the life Vance and I had planned, but something equally valuable. A relationship based on honesty, mutual support, and resilience. When I graduated medical school, 7-year-old Marcus sat in the audience wearing a miniature white coat I'd had specially made, clapping louder than anyone when my name was called. My parents, seated beside him, beamed with pride not just for me but for the grandson who had become the center of our small, mighty family. My residency years tested us both. Brutal hours, overnight shifts, the constant physical and emotional demands of hospital work. I missed school plays and parent-teacher conferences. Arrived home too exhausted some nights to do more than kiss Marcus's forehead before collapsing into bed. But unlike Vance, I never pretended my absence was temporary when it wasn't. I never promised time I couldn't give. Instead, I involved Marcus in my journey, explaining my schedule, celebrating small victories together, creating special rituals for our limited time. Every Sunday my one guaranteed day off became sacred. No studying, no hospital calls, no distractions. Just Marcus and me, exploring museums, flying kites in Central Park, cooking complicated recipes from countries we dreamed of visiting someday. I was determined that my son would never doubt his importance in my life, even when circumstances limited our time together. By the time I completed my residency, Marcus was in middle school, showing remarkable aptitude for science and mathematics. He developed his father's intensity of focus, able to lose himself for hours in projects that captured his interest. But unlike Vance, Marcus balanced that focus with genuine empathy, an ability to connect with others that came from his own experience of loss. Sometimes I caught glimpses of Vance in business magazines or on financial news programs. Blackwood Properties had indeed expanded exponentially, with developments across Asia and Europe. He'd remarried a French model-turned-designer 20 years his junior and become more reclusive, rarely giving interviews or attending public events. I told myself I didn't care. That his life no longer intersected with ours in any meaningful way. I almost believed it. Until Marcus turned 13 and found a decade-old magazine with his father's face on the cover. "This is my dad, isn't it?" he asked, studying the image with clinical detachment. The one who left. I'd never lied to him about Vance's absence, but I'd carefully curated the narrative, emphasizing that the failure was Vance's, not Marcus's. That some people aren't equipped for parenthood. That his father's departure reflected no shortcoming in him. Yes, I admitted. That's your father. He looks like me, Marcus observed. Around the eyes. You have his focus, I said carefully. The way you concentrate so completely on things that interest you, that's very much him. Is he really a billionaire? He's wealthy, yes. And he didn't want me. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, broke something inside me. He didn't want the responsibility of being your father, I corrected. That's his tragedy, not yours. He missed knowing the most amazing person I've ever met. That night, after Marcus went to bed, I allowed myself to cry for the first time in years. Not for the marriage that had failed, but for the father my son would never know, and for the man who would never understand what he'd thrown away. Marcus didn't mention Vance again for several years. He excelled in school, especially in science and mathematics. He volunteered at the hospital where I worked, initially filing papers and running errands, eventually advancing to more substantial responsibilities as he got older. He developed a particular interest in cardiology, fascinated by the mechanical precision of the human heart combined with its emotional resonance in literature and culture. When he announced his intention to apply to medical school during his junior year of high school, I felt a complex mix of pride and vindication. You don't have to become a doctor because of me, I told him, wanting to ensure this was his genuine desire, not an attempt to please me. I'm not, he replied with the directness that characterized all his communication. I'm doing it because the human body is the most fascinating system I've ever studied. And because I've seen how you change people's lives, Mom. How you're there for them on their worst days. He was accepted to Columbia on a merit scholarship, though he could have easily afforded tuition with the untouched trust fund. He refused to use what he called Blackwood money for his education. I want to earn this, he insisted. On my own terms. I recognized the subtle rebuke to his absent father, but didn't comment. Marcus had earned the right to define his relationship or non-relationship with Vance however he chose. The years of medical school transformed Marcus from a thoughtful teenager into a confident young man. He maintained his father's intense focus but tempered it with a compassion born from his own experience of absence. Where Vance saw buildings as assets, Marcus saw patients as individuals with stories that extended beyond the examination room. He specialized in cardiology, drawn to the heart's complex interplay of electrical and mechanical systems. The irony wasn't lost on me, my son, healing the very organ his father had metaphorically lacked. After completing his residency, Marcus was hired by Manhattan Memorial Hospital, one of the city's premier medical institutions. At 28, he was younger than most of his colleagues but already developing a reputation for exceptional diagnostic skills and bedside manner. What he didn't know, what I discovered only after he'd accepted the position, was that Vance Blackwood sat on the hospital's board of directors. One of many prestigious appointments he'd accumulated as his wealth and influence had grown. I debated telling Marcus, tormented by the possibility that they might encounter each other in some hospital corridor or board meeting. But the likelihood seemed remote. Board members rarely interacted with staff physicians, particularly junior ones. And Vance attended meetings irregularly, often sending representatives in his place. So I remained silent, telling myself I was protecting my son from unnecessary anxiety, not avoiding a difficult conversation. Which brings us back to the New Year's Gala at Blackwood Tower, where 15 years of careful separation were about to collapse in 15 seconds. I'd accepted the invitation as director of the East Side Community Health Initiative, a clinic serving neighborhoods Blackwood Properties was eyeing for development. The corporation needed community partners to soften its reputation for aggressive gentrification. My clinic needed funding to continue serving vulnerable populations. A mutually beneficial arrangement, on paper. Marcus had mentioned working the event as part of the medical team's standard procedure for high-profile gatherings where wealthy donors might need attention, but we hadn't discussed the connection to his father. I'd convinced myself lightning wouldn't strike, that in a ballroom filled with hundreds of guests, they would remain in separate orbits. I'd spent the evening avoiding Vance while appearing not to, circulating among potential donors, discussing my clinic's work with board members who might influence funding decisions. I caught glimpses of him across the room, older now, silver threading his dark hair, but still commanding attention without apparent effort. His new wife, Elise, glittered beside him, younger than me by at least 2 decades, perfectly polished in a way I had never managed even during our marriage. Marcus remained stationed discreetly near the back of the ballroom with other medical personnel, professional and alert but essentially invisible to the guests who viewed them as just another aspect of the event's careful organization. Until the moment Vance collapsed, and invisibility became impossible. Watching my son perform CPR on the man who'd abandoned him, I felt the careful compartmentalization of 15 years crumbling. Every boundary I'd constructed between our past and present dissolved as Marcus's hands I'd guided through childhood scraped knees and teenage science experiments now worked to restart his father's heart. Security cleared the ballroom, herding guests to adjacent reception areas, voices calm but expressions betraying the seriousness of the situation. I remained, frozen in place, as medics arrived with a stretcher. Marcus continued directing the emergency response, his training transcending the surreal circumstance. "Pulse is weak but present," he reported, shifting to allow the paramedics access. "BP is 90/60ths and falling. Likely myocardial infarction. We need to move now." As they wheeled Vance toward the service elevator, Marcus glanced up and saw me still standing there. Confusion flickered across his features. What was his mother doing at a Blackwood event? Before professionalism reasserted itself. "Mom, I have to go with the patient," he called. "I'll call you later." I nodded, unable to form words as the doors closed, taking both my son and his unconscious father away. The ballroom emptied rapidly, guests dispersing with the practiced discretion of the wealthy confronted with unpleasantness. Elise had gone with the medical team, her composed facade cracking only slightly as she followed the stretcher. I stood alone among abandoned champagne flutes and half-eaten canapes, trying to process what had just happened. How do I tell him? The question looped in my mind as I mechanically gathered my things and headed for the exit. How do I tell my son that he just saved the life of the man who walked away from him? That the patient he's treating is the father whose absence shaped his entire childhood? In the taxi to the hospital, I changed from my gala dress into the spare clothes I always kept in my bag, a habit from years of unexpected medical emergencies. By the time I arrived at Manhattan Memorial, I had composed myself enough to function, though my heart continued its arrhythmic pounding. The emergency department hummed with the controlled chaos I knew intimately from my own career. No one questioned my presence as I moved through familiar corridors, the hospital ID clipped to my coat granting automatic access. I found a quiet corner in the waiting area and sat, preparing for what would come next. 3 hours later, the elevator doors opened, and Marcus appeared. Still in his tuxedo pants but wearing a wrinkled dress shirt with his hospital ID badge, he looked exhausted but composed as he scanned the waiting area and spotted me. "Mom." He approached, brow furrowed with confusion. "You didn't have to come. I could have met you at home. How is he?" I asked the question automatic after years as a physician, stable. It was a significant cardiac event, but we intervened quickly. They're prepping him for bypass surgery. He sat beside me, his confusion deepening. "Why were you at his party?" "My clinic is being considered for Blackwood funding," I explained, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I didn't know you'd be working the event." Marcus studied me with the same intensity Vance had once used in negotiations. "You knew who he was, the patient. When they were taking him out, you looked strange. Like you recognized him." I took a deep breath. The moment I'd simultaneously dreaded and planned for had arrived without warning or preparation. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you." I paused, searching for the right words, finding none that would soften what came next. "The man you treated tonight, Vance Blackwood, he's your father." Marcus went completely still, his expression unreadable. "My father," he repeated flatly. Yes. I performed CPR on my biological father. Yes. He stood abruptly, pacing the small waiting area. His movements were controlled but tense, like a tightly wound spring. Does he know who I am? That I work at his hospital? I don't think so. We haven't had any contact in 15 years. 15 years, 3 months, and approximately 12 days, Marcus said with clinical precision. I checked the date on his last child support payment once. The statement hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been protecting Marcus from the pain of abandonment, he'd been quietly calculating its exact duration. Why didn't you tell me I was working at his hospital? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. I didn't know he was on the board until after you were hired. By then, it seemed unlikely your paths would ever cross. The board members rarely interact with resident physicians. Except when said board member has a heart attack at his own party, Marcus observed with grim humor. I should have told you, I admitted. I was trying to protect you from what? The truth? That my father is one of the wealthiest men in the city and couldn't be bothered to attend a single school play or baseball game. His laugh held no humor. I've known that since I was 13 and found that magazine. There's a difference between knowing facts and being confronted with the person who created those facts, I said gently. I wanted to spare you that confrontation for as long as possible. Marcus sank back into the chair beside me, suddenly looking exhausted. Well, the universe apparently had other plans. My first major cardiac case as attending physician, and it's the father I've never met. We sat in silence for several minutes, the hospital's ambient sounds, distant pages, quiet conversations, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum filling the space between us. I need to check on him, Marcus finally said. Professional responsibility. Of course. Do you want to come? The question surprised me. Do you want me to? I think. He hesitated. I think I might need you there. Not for him. For me. I nodded, something tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with cardiac function. We took the elevator to the cardiac care unit in silence. Outside Vance's room, Marcus paused. His wife is with him. The young one. Elise, I supplied. I saw her at the gala. Should I tell them who I am? I touched his arm gently. That's entirely your decision. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. He nodded once, straightened his shoulders, and entered the room. Vance lay connected to monitors, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. Elise sat beside the bed, her perfect makeup streaked by tears, her gala gown replaced by designer loungewear that somehow still looked elegant even in a hospital setting. She looked up as we entered. Doctor, she acknowledged Marcus before her gaze shifted to me with a slight frown. And this is Dr. Chen, Marcus said smoothly. My colleague. I watched for any recognition in her eyes, but there was none. Of course not. Why would Vance have shared pictures of his first wife with his second? Mrs. Blackwood, I'm the attending physician who initially treated your husband, Marcus continued in his professional voice. I wanted to check his vitals before the surgical team took over. She nodded, moving aside as Marcus approached the bed and began examining Vance with methodical precision. BP is improving, he noted. Oxygen levels are good. The surgical team should be here shortly to explain the procedure. As if summoned, 2 surgeons entered, nodding to Marcus before turning their attention to Elise. Mrs. Blackwood, we need to prep your husband for surgery now. She gathered her things, casting one last worried look at Vance before following the surgeons out. Marcus remained, staring down at the man who had helped create him. He doesn't know, I said quietly. No. Marcus continued checking monitors. And now isn't the time to tell him. He's heavily sedated, and the stress wouldn't be good for his condition. What will you do when he recovers? Marcus was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he finally admitted. Part of me wants to tell him everything, who I am, what I've achieved without his help or influence. Make him understand exactly what he missed. He adjusted Vance's fore with gentle hands. But another part of me thinks that would just be performative. Something I'd do for my own satisfaction, not because it would change anything meaningful. I watched my son, this remarkable young man I'd raised alone, tend to the father who had abandoned him, and felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to my eyes. Whatever you decide, I said, remember that his response or lack thereof doesn't define your worth. That was established long ago, by your own actions and choices. Marcus nodded, his gaze still on Vance's monitors. They'll be coming to take him to surgery soon. We should go. In the hallway, he stopped suddenly. You know what's strange? I've imagined meeting him hundreds of times. Practiced what I'd say. How I'd remain perfectly composed while explaining exactly what he missed by walking away. He shook his head. But tonight, when it actually happened, all I could think about was his declining arterial oxygen levels and whether the left anterior descending artery was completely blocked. Because you're a doctor, I said. Because you've become someone who saves lives instead of someone who keeps score. He smiled, then a small, tired smile that nevertheless reached his eyes. I have rounds tomorrow morning. Will you be okay getting home? I'll be fine. I hesitated. Will you? Yes, he said, and I believed him. Oddly enough, seeing him like that vulnerable, human, fallible makes the past seem less important somehow. Less defining. We parted at the hospital entrance, Marcus heading to the physician's lounge to change before heading home, me stepping into the cold January air to hail a taxi. As the city lights blurred past the window, I thought about the strange symmetry of the night. How Vance's collapse had inadvertently connected him to the son he'd abandoned. How Marcus had used the skills he'd developed during his father's absence to potentially save that father's life. I thought about how abandonment had shaped my son not into a mirror of his father's selfishness, but into its opposite, a healer committed to presence rather than absence, to saving rather than walking away. Have you ever witnessed someone turn what broke them into their greatest strength? Comment healer below if you've seen how pain can transform into purpose, and like this video if you believe that sometimes the universe arranges the most unexpected reunions at exactly the right moment. Subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories for more tales of family secrets, unexpected twists, and the healing power of truth. The next morning, my phone rang just as I was preparing for work. Mom. Marcus's voice was steady. He made it through surgery. Full recovery expected. That's good news, I said neutrally. I'm listed as his attending physician. A pause. He's asked to speak with me when he's more alert. And will you? Yes, he said after a moment. Not because he deserves an explanation or relationship, but because I think I need the conversation. For myself. I understand. I won't tell him who I am, Marcus continued. Not yet, anyway. I want to observe him first. See the man he is now, not just the ghost I've carried. Whatever you decide, I assured him, I'm here. I know, he said simply. You always have been. After we hung up, I stood by my apartment window, watching the city wake up to the new year. 15 years ago, I believed Vance's abandonment was the end of something vital. Now I understood it had been difficult and painful, yes, but a beginning nonetheless. What would happen between Marcus and Vance remained to be written. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. But whatever emerged from this unexpected collision of past and present would be shaped not by abandonment but by the strength forged in its aftermath. My son didn't need his father's acknowledgement to be whole. He'd already built that wholeness himself, one careful, deliberate choice at a time. Like the doctor he'd become, healing others while healing himself. Over the next 3 days, I heard from Marcus only through brief text updates. Vance was recovering well. No complications from surgery. Expected discharge within a week. Nothing about their interactions, if any had occurred. I didn't press. This was Marcus's journey to navigate. His decision about what relationship, if any, he wanted with the father who had walked away. On the fourth day after the gala, as I was finishing clinic hours, my phone buzzed with a message. "Can you meet for coffee? We need to talk." 20 minutes later, I found Marcus at our regular spot, a small cafe halfway between my clinic and the hospital. He sat at a corner table, still wearing his white coat, hands wrapped around a mug that had likely gone cold based on the untouched pastry beside it. "He's asking questions," Marcus said without preamble as I sat down. "About me. My background. My training. What have you told him?" "The truth, mostly. Columbia Medical School. Cardiology specialty. Research interests." He asked about my parents. Marcus's gaze met mine. I said my mother is a physician who runs a community health clinic. I didn't mention my father. "And he didn't recognize your name?" Marcus shook his head. "Why would he? Chen is your maiden name, not his. And Marcus could belong to anyone. How does it feel? Being with him?" My son considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Strange. Like meeting a character from a book I read long ago. I know his story, but he doesn't seem entirely real to me." He took a sip of his coffee, grimaced at its coldness. "He's different than I expected." "How so?" "More human. He's not the monster I sometimes imagined as a child, or the cold businessman from those magazine profiles. He asks the nurses about their families. Thanks the custodial staff by name. Apologizes when pain makes him short-tempered." I nodded, remembering the Vance I'd first met. The one who asked about my studies and spoke of his mother with unguarded grief. "Does he remind you of me?" Marcus asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "In some ways. You have his focus, his analytical mind. His capacity for total concentration on things that interest you. But you're not him, Marcus. You never have been." He nodded slowly. "I've been afraid of that, you know. That I might carry some genetic predisposition to abandon people who need me. Some inherited flaw that made him walk away and might someday make me do the same." My heart ached at the vulnerability in his admission. That's not how humanity works. We aren't programmed by our DNA to repeat our parents' mistakes. We observe, we learn, and we choose differently. He asked about my family today, Marcus continued. Whether I'm married, have children. I told him no to both. He said something that's been echoing in my head all day. What was that? That building things is easier than building relationships. That he'd realized too late which one actually matters. Marcus's hands tightened around his mug. Do you think he was talking about us? About you and me? I doubt it, I said gently. He has no reason to connect you to his past. Marcus fell silent, absorbing this. After a moment, he spoke again. I've decided to tell him who I am. What he missed. But not out of anger or revenge. I need him to know that his absence didn't define me. That I became someone without his help. Are you sure? Yes. He nodded, more certain now. It's not about getting answers or explanations. It's about closing a door that's been partly open my entire life. I need to look him in the eye as equals, not as patient and doctor, or father and abandoned child, but as two adults making a conscious choice about what happens next. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by his wisdom and courage. Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. He smiled then, brief but genuine. I know, Mom. That's never been in question. The next afternoon, Marcus called again. This time, his voice held an edge I couldn't immediately identify. He's being discharged tomorrow, he said without greeting. I'm going to tell him tonight, when I do final rounds. Do you want me there? No. He paused. Yes. Maybe. I don't know. I'll be at the hospital at 7, I said. If you want me there, I'll come up. If not, I'll wait in the cafeteria. Your decision. Thank you, he said, the relief evident in his voice. I arrived at Manhattan Memorial at 6:45, the familiar corridors both comforting and anxiety-inducing. How many times had I walked these same paths during my residency, exhausted but determined? Now I moved through them with a different purpose, supporting my son through a confrontation 15 years in the making. My phone buzzed at precisely 7 o'clock. Room 714. He's alone. Elise left for dinner. 7th floor, cardiac care unit. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the physical activity to settle my nerves. Outside room 714, I paused, breathing deeply before knocking softly. Marcus opened the door, his expression a careful blank. Behind him, I could see Vance sitting up in bed, his hospital gown a jarring contrast to the power suits I'd associated with him for so long. Dr. Chen, Marcus said formally, maintaining our pretense of professional connection. Thank you for consulting on Mr. Blackwood's case. I stepped into the room, feeling the weight of Vance's gaze as he assessed this new visitor. Recognition didn't come immediately, why would it? 15 years had changed us both, and he had no reason to expect his ex-wife in his hospital room. Then his eyes widened slightly. Olivia? Hello, Vance, I said, keeping my voice neutral. You're looking well, all things considered. His gaze shifted between Marcus and me, confusion evident. You two know each other. Marcus moved to stand beside me, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. Dr. Chen is my mother, he said simply. Vance's expression remained puzzled. For a moment, I thought he hadn't understood. Then, slowly, comprehension dawned in his eyes, the same gray eyes that had passed to our son. Your mother, he repeated, his voice suddenly hoarse. And your father. Is you, Marcus completed, his tone clinical rather than accusatory. My name is Marcus Chen. Biologically, Marcus Blackwood. I was 3 when you decided fatherhood wasn't for you. Vance seemed to shrink against the hospital pillows, the color draining from his face. His gaze fixed on Marcus with an intensity that seemed to physically pain him. My son, he whispered. You're my son. Biologically speaking, yes, Marcus confirmed. You provided genetic material and financial support. He gestured around the room. And apparently a workplace, though neither of us knew that until recently. Vance's hand moved toward the call button, and for a moment, I thought he was going to summon a nurse, end this confrontation before it truly began. Instead, he pressed his fingers against his eyes, a gesture I remembered from our marriage. His attempt to physically contain emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully constructed control. I've imagined this moment, he said finally, his voice rough. Meeting you again. Not like this. Not with you saving my life before I even knew who you were. I didn't save your life because of who you are, Marcus clarified. I did it because it's my job. Because it's who I am. A cardiologist, Vance observed. Ironic. A slight smile touched Marcus's lips. Yes. I specialize in the organ you metaphorically lack. The bluntness of the statement hung in the air between them. I held my breath, uncertain how Vance would respond to such direct confrontation. To my surprise, he laughed, a short, painful sound that held more acknowledgement than humor. Well deserved, he conceded. More than deserved. He looked at me then, his expression softening. You raised him well, Olivia. Better than I could have. Don't, I said sharply. Don't rewrite history to make your absence some noble sacrifice. You left because fatherhood was inconvenient to your ambitions. Because Marcus and I were complications in the narrative you were building. We survived and thrived without you because we had to, not because your abandonment was somehow beneficial. Vance nodded slowly. You're right. There's no way to frame what I did as anything but selfish. His gaze returned to Marcus. I won't insult you by claiming I thought of you often, wondered about the man you were becoming. The truth is I deliberately didn't think about you. I compartmentalized your existence the way I did everything that didn't fit my vision for my life. Why tell me now? Marcus asked. Why not maintain the compartmentalization? Because nearly dying has a way of rearranging priorities, Vance replied. And because seeing you, the doctor who saved my life, forces me to confront the magnitude of what I threw away. The monitors beeped steadily, marking the passage of time in this strange reunion. Marcus moved to check the readings, his professional instincts temporarily overriding the emotional complexity of the moment. Your blood pressure is elevated, he noted. That's not ideal after surgery. Learning your abandoned son saved your life will do that, Vance observed dryly. Marcus adjusted something on the floor, his movements precise. You should rest. This conversation isn't doing your recovery any favors. Vance caught his wrist, the gesture tentative rather than commanding. Will you come back? Tomorrow or the next day? I'd like to. He paused, seemingly at a loss for words. I'd like to know you. If you're willing. Marcus gently removed his father's hand. I'll be doing rounds tomorrow morning. We can talk then, briefly. As for knowing me. He glanced at me, then back at Vance. That depends on what you do with the information you now have. I'm not interested in being your redemption story or your second chance. I've built a life without you. A good one. I understand, Vance said, though his expression suggested he was still processing the enormity of what had occurred. And Olivia, your clinic. The funding application. I'll make sure it's approved. I stiffened. We don't want your money, Vance. Not as some form of retroactive payment for your absence. The clinic serves communities affected by my developments, he pointed out. It would be funded regardless of our personal history. This just expedites the process. Before I could respond, Marcus interjected. We'll discuss the clinic another time. Right now, you need to rest, and we need to leave. Outside in the hallway, Marcus leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. That was intense. I supplied. Anticlimactic, he corrected. 15 years of wondering what I'd say to him, what he'd say to me. And in the end, he's just a man. Flawed, aging, confronting his mistakes too late to change their impact. What will you do now? My son straightened, adjusting his white coat with the same precision he brought to all his movements. Now I'll continue being his doctor until he's discharged. After that. He shrugged. We'll see. I don't owe him a relationship, but I might owe myself the chance to know who he is beyond the absence that shaped my life. As we walked toward the elevator, Marcus added, he's not what I expected. What did you expect? A monster, I think. Or at least someone obviously selfish, obviously flawed. Someone I could look at and immediately understand why he left. He pressed the elevator button. Instead, he seems human. Complex. And that's harder to reconcile with the abandonment than if he'd just been obviously terrible. The elevator arrived, empty at this late hour. We stepped inside, the doors closing on the floor where Vance lay processing his own unexpected revelations. Will you tell him about the trust fund? Marcus asked as we descended. How have you never touched it? How I refused to use his money for medical school. I considered this. Only if you want me to. I do. He should know that we made it without him. That his money couldn't buy what he threw away. The elevator reached the ground floor, opening to the quiet evening lobby. Are you okay? I asked as we walked toward the exit. Marcus was silent for a moment, considering the question with his typical thoroughness. I think I will be, he finally said. Meeting him, actually seeing him as a person rather than an absence, changes things. Not in the way I expected. It doesn't heal anything or answer everything. But it makes him finite, you know. A specific person with specific failures, not this looming shadow over my entire life. Outside, the January air bit at our faces, the city lights reflecting off fresh snow that had fallen during our hospital visit. "I'm proud of you," I said simply. Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "That's all that's ever mattered, Mom." We parted there, Marcus heading to his apartment near the hospital, me to mine across town. As I watched him walk away, confident and purposeful in his white coat, I felt something settle within me. A peace I hadn't expected to find in this strange confrontation with our past. Whatever happened next between Marcus and Vance would unfold on my son's terms. He approached this unexpected connection not as a wounded child seeking validation, but as a complete person choosing whether to add a new relationship to an already full life. The next week passed in a blur of clinic appointments and administrative meetings. Marcus texted occasionally with updates that were clinical in their brevity. "Discharged this morning. Follow-up scheduled for next week. Elise now knows who I am." She was surprised. I didn't press for details, understanding that he needed to process this seismic shift at his own pace. Then, on Friday evening, a message that made me pause. "He's asked to meet for dinner tomorrow. At Lucien's. 7 p.m. Would you come too?" Lucien's. The restaurant where Vance had first taken me, 20 years earlier. The place where I'd been simultaneously intimidated by the lack of prices on the menu and enchanted by the man who'd seemed genuinely interested in my ambitions. "Are you sure you want me there?" I replied. His response came immediately. "Yes. This involves all three of us. The past, present, and whatever comes next. I'll be there." Saturday evening found me standing outside Lucien's, smoothing the front of a dress I hadn't worn in years. Not the dramatic entrance I'd sometimes fantasized about during darker moments post-divorce, arriving in stunning designer wear, successful and untouchable. Just me, Olivia Chen, in a simple black dress that had seen better days but still maintained its dignity. Rather like its owner. Marcus arrived moments later, looking more nervous than I'd seen him since his medical school interviews. "He's already inside," he informed me. "With Elise. I hope that's okay." I nodded, though my stomach tightened at the thought of meeting Vance's young wife in a social context rather than the clinical environment of the hospital. The maitre d' led us to a quiet corner table where Vance and Elise waited. He stood as we approached, leaning slightly on a cane, a new addition since his hospitalization. Elise remained seated, her expression politely neutral but eyes sharp with assessment. "Olivia, Marcus," Vance greeted us with surprising warmth. "Thank you for coming." We settled into uncomfortable silence as menus were distributed, wine poured, pleasantries exchanged. The tension stretched until Elise, surprisingly, broke it. "This is bizarre," she stated flatly. "My husband's ex-wife and the son he never mentioned having, all pretending this is a normal dinner. Can we acknowledge that, at least?" The bluntness startled a laugh out of Marcus. "Definitely bizarre," he agreed. "Possibly unprecedented in the annals of awkward family reunions." Vance's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Elise has always valued directness," he explained. "It's one of her many qualities I've come to appreciate." "How long have you known?" I asked Elise, curious despite myself. "About Marcus, I mean." "Since the day after Vance's surgery," she replied, her French accent more pronounced with emotion. "He told me everything. His first marriage, his son, his—" She hesitated, glancing at Vance. "My cowardice," he supplied quietly. "My greatest failure." Elisa's expression softened slightly. "We have no children of our own," she explained to Marcus. "Vance always said he didn't want them. Now I understand it wasn't about not wanting children. It was about the child he already had and lost." Marcus studied her with clinical detachment. "Did that change how you see him? Knowing what he did?" She considered the question seriously. "Yes and no. I always knew there was something unfinished in him. Something he wouldn't speak about. Now I understand what it was. She shrugged, an elegantly Gallic gesture. We all have pasts, Dr. Chen. Things we regret. The question is what we do with those regrets. The conversation shifted as appetizers arrived, moving to safer territory. Vance's recovery progress. The clinic's work in underserved communities. Marcus's research interests. By the time entrees were served, the atmosphere had relaxed slightly, though undercurrents of tension remained. I've been thinking about what happens next, Vance said as dessert menus appeared. If anything happens next. That's entirely up to both of you. He looked between Marcus and me. I understand if you want nothing to do with me beyond professional interactions. I've earned that exclusion. What would you want? Marcus asked directly. If the choice were entirely yours. Vance set down his water glass, his expression serious. I'd want the chance to know my son as the exceptional man he's become. Not to replace the years I missed or pretend I had any role in shaping who you are. But to learn who Marcus Chen is now, on his own terms. He turned to me. And I'd want Olivia to know that not a day passes that I don't recognize the magnitude of what I threw away. Both of you. The family we might have been. Pretty words, I observed, not unkindly. But words are easy, Vance. They always were for you. You're right, he acknowledged. Which is why I won't offer promises or declarations. Just an open door, if either of you ever choose to walk through it. Marcus glanced at me, then back at his father. I'm willing to try, he said finally. Limited contact at first. Professional boundaries maintained at the hospital. Perhaps occasional dinners like this, to see where it leads. Relief flooded Vance's features before he carefully controlled his expression. I'd like that very much. Elisa's hand covered his on the table, a small gesture of support that spoke volumes about their relationship. Despite myself, I felt glad that he had found someone who understood him, even the broken parts he'd hidden for so long. And you, Olivia? Vance asked quietly. Is there any possibility of, not forgiveness, perhaps, but peace between us? I considered the question honestly. I forgave you years ago, Vance, I said finally. Not for your sake, but for mine. For Marcus's. Carrying that anger was too heavy a burden, especially while raising a child who needed stability more than justice. I paused, finding the right words. I don't want or need anything from you now. My life is full and meaningful without your presence in it. But for Marcus's sake, I'm willing to establish a civil relationship. Whatever form that takes. Thank you, he said simply. That's more than I deserve. Yes, it is, I agreed, but found myself smiling slightly to soften the words. Yet here we are anyway. The evening ended not with dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations, but with tentative plans for another dinner the following month. Small steps toward whatever relationship might be possible after 15 years of absence. Outside the restaurant, Marcus and I stood together watching Vance help Elise into a waiting town car, his movements still careful from his surgery. What do you think? I asked my son. About all of this? Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I think it's strange how life creates these full circles without our planning. How the son becomes the father's healer. How absence can shape presence in ways we never anticipated. He turned to me, his face softening. And I think you were right, all those years ago. His leaving was his tragedy, not mine. He missed knowing the most amazing person I've ever met. I smiled, recognizing my own words from years earlier, when Marcus had first discovered his father's identity. Who's that? I asked, playing along. Me, obviously, he replied with a flash of humor. But you're a close second. I laughed then, linking my arm through his as we walked away from the restaurant, away from Vance and the past he represented, toward the future we'd built without him, a future suddenly expanded with unexpected possibilities. The heart is a remarkable organ, Marcus often told his patients. It can withstand tremendous damage and still continue beating. It can heal from injuries that seem catastrophic. It can adapt to changing conditions in ways that defy medical explanation. In the months following Vance's collapse at the New Year's Gala, I came to understand that families are much the same way. They can fracture and reform. They can survive abandonment and betrayal. They can expand to include those once excluded, not through obligation but through choice. Vance Blackwood would never be the father Marcus deserved during those crucial early years. No amount of belated attention or support could restore what had been lost. But perhaps he could become something else. Not a replacement for the parent he failed to be, but a new presence defined by its current authenticity rather than its past failures. And perhaps that was enough. Not a fairy tale ending where all wounds magically heal, but a human one, where broken things find new purposes in their reassembled forms. If there's someone in your life who walked away when you needed them most, comment forgiveness below if you found peace without their presence. Like this video if you believe that sometimes what seems like an ending is actually the beginning of something unexpected. And subscribe to Mr. Arden's Heart Stories for more tales of family, forgiveness, and the courage to face what we've lost while celebrating what remains. 3 months after that fateful New Year's night, I stood in the newly renovated Eastside Community Health Clinic, surveying improvements that would allow us to serve hundreds more patients annually. State-of-the-art equipment. Expanded examination rooms. A dedicated pediatric wing designed to make medical visits less intimidating for children. The funding had indeed been approved not as retroactive payment for Vance's absence in Marcus's life, but as recognition of the vital work we performed in communities affected by Blackwood Properties developments. A corporate responsibility program that happened to intersect with personal history. Marcus had established careful boundaries with his newly discovered father. Professional distance at the hospital, where Vance had joined the patient advisory board during his recovery. Monthly dinners where they slowly built a relationship based on present connections rather than past obligations. Occasional text messages sharing articles or observations that reminded one of the other. Not the relationship they might have had if Vance had remained present throughout Marcus's childhood. Something different. Something chosen rather than inherited. As for me, I maintained a polite distance. Civil interactions when our paths crossed, but no pretense that we could or should recapture what had been lost. The young medical student who had fallen for Vance Blackwood's charm and vulnerability no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had built her life on her own terms, who had raised an extraordinary son without his father's presence, who had found purpose in healing others while healing herself. 15 years ago, when Vance walked away from our family, I believed it was the end of something essential. I couldn't imagine then how completely we would rebuild from those ruins, creating something stronger and more authentic than what had been destroyed. Now I understand that sometimes what breaks us becomes the foundation for something we couldn't have imagined in our previous, unbroken state. Like a bone that heals stronger at the site of fracture. Like a heart that continues beating despite profound injury. Like a family redefined not by biology or obligation but by choice and commitment. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my reflections. Dinner tonight? Just us. I need your advice about something. Marcus, requesting our weekly mother-son dinner. Not because he had nowhere else to go or no one else to ask, but because after everything, after the revelation of his father's identity and the tentative reconnection that followed, he still valued my perspective above all others. I smiled as I responded. 7 p.m. I'll bring dessert. Some things remain constant, even when everything else changes. Some bonds strengthen rather than weaken under pressure. Some loves transcend the circumstances of their creation. The clinic door opened, admitting a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip. Her expression held the particular mixture of worry and determination I'd come to recognize in parents seeking care for their children. Dr. Chen? She asked hesitantly. The receptionist said you might have time to see Tyler. He's been running a fever since yesterday. I smiled, gesturing them toward an examination room. Of course. Let's take a look at him. As I followed them down the hallway, I caught my reflection in a newly installed window. Dr. Olivia Chen. Director of a community health initiative. Mother of a brilliant young cardiologist. Ex-wife of a billionaire who had once walked away and now sought a second chance at connection. All of these identities, layered and complex, shaped by choices both mine and others. All creating the woman I had become, not despite the abandonment that had once defined me, but because of how I had responded to it. Marcus was right, that night outside Lucien's. Life does create these full circles without our planning. The woman who had once been left behind had become the one strong enough to determine the terms of reconnection. The child who had been abandoned had become the physician skilled enough to save his father's life. And somehow, in the strange alchemy of human experience, the worst moment of my life had set in motion the circumstances that would ultimately lead to my greatest pride, not the clinic or my professional achievements, but the son who had learned from his father's absence how to be consistently, authentically present for those who needed him. Like the doctor he had become, healing others while healing himself.